Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to review the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy by Cixin Liu, although it's probably better known as the Three-Body Problem trilogy. The three books were first published between 2006 and 2010, although they were only translated into English much later in the second half of the 2010s. While each book has a somewhat self-contained story arc, it should really be seen as one big story across the three books. They definitely need to be read in the right order, and in my opinion, only reading the first one will leave you pretty unsatisfied, both because a lot of the story that's been built up is not really resolved, but also because I thought the first book was probably the weakest of the three. So I would suggest, if you decide to give this a go, to put yourself in the frame of mind of being prepared to read the three books. The first book starts with a pretty dramatic scene set during the Cultural Revolution in China, so around the 60s, 70s. But the timeline shifts pretty quickly to present day. And we follow a number of characters who are involved in a top secret project where signals are being sent into space in order to look for other forms of intelligent life in the universe. The scope of the story expands pretty dramatically, both from a timeline as well as from a spatial perspective, especially as you move into books 2 and 3. The pace of the plot varies throughout the book. However, I never found myself bored or uninterested in the story. The stakes are kept high pretty much at all times, and the story is engaging throughout. The characters are definitely not one of the strong points of these books. None of the characters ever feel particularly memorable or particularly well fleshed out. There are a lot of stereotypes and cliches that plays into the characters, and things like the depiction of how they fall in love or get attached to other people is definitely not particularly deep or thoughtful. Unlike in classic sci-fi, where authors were not even really trying to develop their characters, here I got the impression that the author was trying to create memorable characters. However, in my opinion, he was never particularly successful. And especially I feel he can't really write female characters either. And if you're really sensitive to casual sexism or instances of fridging or anything like that, it might be something you want to think about before you pick up these books. I can't really read or speak Chinese, so I couldn't pick up the original version. But if anyone watching actually has read the original version, I'd be really curious to hear their thoughts about it. The three books were actually translated by two different writers. And quite often I heard comments about how good the translation into English was. But to be completely honest, that hasn't been my impression. Especially in book one, I felt the prose was constantly quite clunky and didn't really work for me that much. The dialogues always feel a bit stilted and not very believable, to the point that you kind of wonder who speaks like that. And I'm not sure how much I can attribute that to the original book versus the quality of the translation versus perhaps cultural differences. However, I have to admit that as the trilogy progressed, I felt that concern diminishing more and more. And again, I'm not sure how much that was actually due to the quality of the translation improving versus me perhaps getting used to the type of writing and the type of prose. And regardless of any argument around the quality of the translation, the prose itself remains very, very dense at all times, and it makes for a slow progress into the book. Whether it's because he's introducing some new scientific concept, or whether it's just because that's the way he likes to write, you will probably find yourself reading and rereading the same passage several times to be able to follow the story. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, and this is not going to be a spoiler, but I've picked like a random passage from one of the three books. And, just to give you an idea of what it reads like, not all of the book is like this, but there's definitely several passages and several instances of this type of prose and this type of language being employed. So again, just something to be aware of. And for that reason, I would imagine it might be a difficult one to pick up as an audiobook. So from what I've said so far, you might think I have not enjoyed these books, but this is where you're wrong, because the themes and the science is where this trilogy completely redeems itself. The scientific concepts he explores are absolutely incredible, and they will really mess up with your head. There's so much going on and so many things he introduces that are absolutely fascinating. Obviously, this book is not for the faint of heart, because if you do not enjoy science, this might be really, really challenging to get through. This is not the sort of science fiction story where science is somewhere in the background, or that is called science fiction just because it's set somewhere in space. This is one where science itself is prominent and ever present throughout the trilogy. So many of the scientific principles that are explored in the books, from string theory to subatomic concepts to multiple dimensions, are instrumental, absolutely key to the development of the story. So if you have absolutely no interest in science, this is not the trilogy for you. But if you do have that sort of interest, this is absolutely mind-blowing. And so many of these concepts are explored in depth in a very, very interesting way. I'm not a scientist myself, so please feel free to contradict me in the comments if you wish. But my understanding is that all of the science that is presented in the trilogy is plausible. So even though a lot of these theories are probably very unlikely to ever come to fruition, in theory, all of them are theoretically possible, which is absolutely stunning. But what I found even more compelling and interesting, and to some extent surprising, was his constant focus on humanity itself and how humanity would react to some of the events that are depicted in the books. There are endless parallels that you can spot between the events as described in the trilogy with actual events in the real world, in our history, or even in current events. To give you an example, the theme of deterrence is explored in a very insightful way, and you only have to look back a few decades to the Cold War to see how that applied to the real world and to our own history. And so many other concepts are explored in a very non-shallow way. You have game theory, or you have the reaction of humanity to the threat of contact with aliens, for instance, and how that translates into religion. And I really liked how Liu depicted the moodiness of public opinion, how the public can change their views so quickly, and even more so over decades. And we only have to look at the last few years to see how that is really true and really believable and relevant into current affairs, and how that translates into excesses and violence if certain conditions are in place. And really, there are so many other themes being explored: freedom versus authoritarianism, or how we think of social and economic progress as a one-way street. But if you look back over the centuries of human development, that's never really been the case. So is that necessarily going to continue? We take all of that for granted, but that might not necessarily be the case. And so many times you find yourself questioning what you yourself would think or react or do in certain situations that are depicted in the trilogy. And I found that sort of mental reflection, and the author calls even if it's only indirect, it's so interesting and so well executed. And if you by any chance are Australian, there's a very special role that Australia is going to play at some point in the story, which is quite funny and ironic, and I think you might enjoy it. I really wanted to talk about the controversial aspects of the author, because quite often I've heard some people objecting to reading these on the ground that the author has been interviewed once by the New York Times and expressed some opinions that were highly questionable, let's put it that way, supporting the Chinese government and what's happening in Xinjiang. Now, obviously, everyone is free to do however they please and do whatever they feel is right for their conscience. And obviously, I'm not going to question that. Or actually, in a way, I am questioning that. However, even if we go beyond the usual argument that we need to separate the artist from the art, and why would you miss out on a terrific trilogy in this case for that reason? So even if we put that aside, just on the specifics of what happened, this is a Chinese author who lives in China with his family, being interviewed abroad by a foreign newspaper. Now, the Chinese government does not have the best record in allowing freedom of speech and open debate. So I'm just going to question you, viewer, if you hold this stance. What would you do if you just wanted to get on with your own life and you just happen to be a successful author who's written books where some of the content of your books is already questionable in terms of being critical of government propaganda, critical of Chinese history and Chinese government actions? If you're in that position and you're being interviewed by a foreign newspaper and they ask you a controversial question, why your wife and your sons and your daughter is back in China, would you decide to play hero and possibly put your freedom or your success in question because of an interview for a foreign newspaper? Maybe you would. I'm not sure what I would do, because I think unless you're in that position, you will not know. You will never know. So my point is, we will never really know what Cixin Liu actually thinks about what's happening in Xinjiang. It could be that he really thinks what he said during the interview, or it might just be that he decided to give priority to the welfare of his family and to the possibility of just having a quiet life. So it's pretty unfair of you, being a social justice warrior from your couch, tweeting away where your actions have absolutely no consequences on your life, to be judging someone whose words might have serious consequences potentially on his life and his family's life. So as I said, obviously everybody's free to do as they please. But I think in this instance, denying yourself of reading a terrific trilogy on the basis of a moral judgment that you're making using highly questionable and deeply flawed parameters is not that smart, in my opinion. If you enjoy classic sci-fi, your Asimovs, your Clarks, your science-heavy sort of concept, the Remembrance of Earth's Past is absolutely the heir of that tradition and takes it so much further in a very stunning and compelling way. While book one was the weakest of the three, in my opinion, book two and book three really pay off if you manage to pull through. Despite its weaknesses, this is a must-read for every fan of hard sci-fi, and my rating for the trilogy as a whole is 8 out of 10. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give me a thumbs up, join our Discord, the link is down below, and I'll see you the next time.